particular song comes on, one you have not heard in years, and something happens that has no obvious practical function whatsoever. You are, for a moment, not simply in the present. You are simultaneously somewhere else, some other time, a specific afternoon, or a specific room, or a specific version of yourself that no longer exists in quite the same form. The feeling that accompanies this experience is complicated in a way that most emotions are not. It contains genuine pleasure and genuine sadness at the same time, a bittersweet quality that does not resolve cleanly into either category, and that seems to derive its particular flavor from precisely this unresolved mixture. This is nostalgia, and it is, as far as researchers have been able to determine, an experience unique to the human species. No other animal, however sophisticated its memory system, appears to engage in anything resembling this specific act of voluntarily, and often involuntarily, revisiting the emotional texture of a past period of one's own life, extracting from that revisiting a complex blend of comfort and loss, and using that blend for psychological purposes that have only recently begun to be understood by science. For most of the history of psychology, nostalgia was regarded not as a curious but harmless quirk of human memory, but as a genuine pathology. The term itself, coined in 1688 by the Swiss physician Johannes Hofer, combined the Greek words nostos, meaning return home, and algos, meaning pain, and was originally used to describe a medical condition observed in Swiss mercenary soldiers serving far from home, characterized by severe homesickness, appetite loss, insomnia, and in some documented cases, a decline severe enough to be considered life-threatening. Nostalgia was treated, for the following 2 centuries, as a genuine medical and later psychiatric disorder, something to be diagnosed, treated, and where possible prevented. It was only in the past 3 decades that the scientific understanding of nostalgia underwent a fundamental transformation, moving from a model of nostalgia as pathology to a model of nostalgia as a sophisticated and largely beneficial psychological resource. A shift driven primarily by the research program of the psychologist Konstantin Sedikides at the University of Southampton, whose work over the past 25 years has done more than any other single researchers to establish nostalgia as a legitimate and well-understood object of scientific study. Let's begin with what Sedikides and his colleagues discovered when they began systematically studying what nostalgia actually does to the people who experience it, rather than assuming, as earlier researchers had, that it was simply a form of maladaptive dwelling on the past. Sedikides' research, conducted across dozens of studies and thousands of participants, found that nostalgia, contrary to its historical reputation, functions overwhelmingly as a psychologically beneficial and self-regulating emotional resource rather than as a symptom of unhealthy attachment to the past. Sedikides documented that nostalgic reflection reliably increases measures of self-esteem, strengthens feelings of social connectedness, increases perceived meaning in life, and provides what he calls existential resource, a buffer against the psychological distress associated with confronting mortality and the passage of time. Critically, Sedikides' research found that nostalgia is not simply triggered passively by external cues like a familiar song, but is also actively and often unconsciously deployed by people as a coping mechanism, specifically in response to negative psychological states. Sedikides documented that inducing feelings of loneliness, meaninglessness, or negative mood in experimental participants reliably increases the frequency and intensity of subsequent nostalgic reflection, and that this nostalgic reflection, once triggered, measurably improves the very psychological states that triggered it in the first place, and functioning as what Sedikides calls a homeostatic emotional regulator, a system that activates specifically when psychological equilibrium has been disrupted and that works to restore that equilibrium. This finding fundamentally inverted the historical understanding of nostalgia. Rather than being a maladaptive retreat from present difficulty into an idealized past, nostalgia functions as an active psychological tool that people deploy, often without conscious awareness that they are doing so, specifically to cope with present difficulty, drawing on the emotional resources of significant past experience to restore psychological stability in the present moment. The specific mechanism through which nostalgia achieves these beneficial effects has been examined in detail by the psychologist Tim Wildschut, Sedekadiz's long-term collaborator at the University of Southampton, whose research has documented that nostalgic memories, compared to ordinary autobiographical memories, are disproportionately populated by close relationships, meaningful social bonds, and experiences of connection and belonging. Wildschut's research found that nostalgic recall functions substantially as a form of social memory, one that reconnects the person experiencing it to a felt sense of relational security and belonging, and that this social connectedness function explains much of nostalgia's demonstrated capacity to counteract feelings of loneliness and social disconnection. This connects directly to why nostalgia carries its characteristic bittersweet quality, rather than being simply pleasant. The psychologist Christine Batcho at Le Moyne College, whose broader research on nostalgia we touched on in an earlier video in this series examining the science of humor, has documented that the bittersweetness of nostalgic experience is not an incidental or unfortunate byproduct, but is central to its psychological function. Batcho's research found that the specific combination of positive affect, deriving from the reconnection with cherished past experience, and negative affect, deriving from the awareness that this experience belongs irretrievably to the past and cannot be directly recovered, produces a unique emotional signature that serves a purpose neither pure positive nor pure negative emotion could achieve on its own. It allows a person to draw genuine comfort and meaning from the past, while simultaneously acknowledging, and to some degree processing, the loss that the passage of time necessarily entails. There is a further dimension of this research that deserves careful attention because it addresses a specific and practically important question that the general beneficial function account leaves partially unresolved: whether nostalgia's benefits depend on the accuracy of the memories involved, or whether nostalgia works through a process that necessarily and functionally involves a degree of positive distortion of the past. The psychologist Christine Batcho, whose research on the bittersweet quality of nostalgia we have already examined, has documented alongside other researchers in the field that nostalgic memories are systematically and measurably more positive than the same events would have been rated at the time they originally occurred, a phenomenon sometimes called the fading affect bias, in which negative emotional content associated with past events fades more quickly from memory over time than positive emotional content does. This finding raises an important interpretive question. Is nostalgia beneficial because it accurately reconnects people with genuinely positive past experience? Or is it beneficial specifically because it involves a systematic, functional editing of the past that removes or softens negative elements while preserving and even amplifying positive ones? The psychologist Konstantin Sedekadis has addressed this question directly, proposing that the positive distortion involved in nostalgic memory is not an incidental flaw, but a functional feature of the system, analogous to other well-documented positive illusions that contribute to psychological well-being, including the optimism bias and the tendency toward positive self-regard that we have examined in earlier videos in this series. Sedekadis' research found that even when participants are explicitly reminded of the negative aspects of a nostalgically recalled period, the beneficial psychological effects of nostalgic reflection persist, suggesting that nostalgia's function does not depend on participants being unaware of or in denial about the more difficult aspects of their past. Rather, nostalgia appears to work by selectively foregrounding specific meaningful and socially connected elements of past experience, allowing a person to draw psychological benefit from those elements, without this process requiring a wholesale, inaccurate rewriting of history. This finding has been extended by research on what psychologists call the redemptive narrative structure that characterizes much nostalgic recall. The psychologist Dan McAdams at Northwestern University, whose extensive research on autobiographical narrative and personal identity has been foundational in personality psychology, has documented that individuals who structure their autobiographical memories, including nostalgic recall of difficult periods, according to what he calls a redemptive sequence, in which hardship is remembered as ultimately leading to growth, connection, or positive transformation, show measurably better psychological adjustment and well-being than individuals whose autobiographical narratives follow what McAdams calls a contamination sequence, in which even positive past experiences are remembered as ultimately being spoiled or undermined by subsequent negative events. McAdams's research suggests that nostalgia's beneficial function may depend less on the specific factual accuracy of any given memory, and more on the overall narrative structure through which a person organizes and makes sense of their extended personal history, with nostalgic reflection serving as one of the primary occasions on which this narrative structuring and restructuring actively occurs. This connects nostalgia to a broader body of research on narrative identity, the psychological framework proposing that human beings do not simply accumulate a passive store of autobiographical memories, but actively and continuously construct an evolving life story that provides coherence, meaning, and a sense of purposeful direction across an individual's extended life course. And nostalgic reflection appears to be one of the primary psychological mechanisms through which this ongoing narrative construction takes place. The specific triggers of nostalgic experience have been studied extensively, revealing patterns that illuminate the underlying psychological architecture of the emotion. The psychologist Clay Routledge at North Dakota State University, another key figure in the modern scientific study of nostalgia, working closely with Sedekadais and Wildschut, has documented that nostalgia is disproportionately triggered by sensory cues, particularly music and smell, more than by other categories of sensory experience, such as visual or tactile stimuli. Routledge's research connects this finding to the underlying neuroanatomy of memory and emotion, noting that olfactory information, unlike information from other senses, is processed through neural pathways with unusually direct and unusually strong connections to the hippocampus and amygdala, the brain structures most centrally involved in autobiographical memory and emotional processing respectively, a neuroanatomical peculiarity that plausibly explains why smell, in particular, produces such vivid and such emotionally intense nostalgic recall compared to other sensory triggers. Routledge's research has also documented a specific and psychologically significant finding regarding who experiences nostalgia and under what circumstances. Rather than being concentrated among older individuals reflecting on a distant past, as popular stereotype might suggest, nostalgia is experienced with substantial frequency across the entire adult lifespan, including among young adults reflecting on relatively recent experience, and is reliably triggered by experiences of transition, uncertainty, and change rather than simply by the objective passage of time. Routledge found that college students during periods of significant life transition, individuals experiencing job loss or career uncertainty, and people navigating major relationship changes all show elevated rates of nostalgic reflection, supporting the broader finding that nostalgia functions as a response to psychological threat and instability rather than simply as a byproduct of accumulated years. The developmental question of when nostalgic capacity first emerges in human cognitive development has been examined by the developmental psychologist Jordana Muroff and colleagues, whose research suggests that fully developed nostalgic capacity, requiring the sophisticated integration of autobiographical memory, temporal self-continuity, and complex emotional regulation, likely does not emerge until adolescence, when the cognitive capacities for constructing a coherent autobiographical narrative and for reflecting on one's own psychological continuity across time become sufficiently developed to support the specific kind of bittersweet temporal comparison that characterizes adult nostalgic experience. This developmental timeline is significant because it suggests nostalgia is not simply an automatic byproduct of having autobiographical memory, which emerges considerably earlier in childhood, but requires additional cognitive machinery specifically related to constructing and reflecting on a continuous sense of self across time. The evolutionary question of why human beings alone appear to have developed this capacity has been addressed by several researchers, with the most compelling account connecting nostalgia to the broader human capacity for what psychologists call mental time travel, the ability to mentally project oneself into the past or future and to experience, in a functionally meaningful way, the emotional and experiential texture of times other than the present moment. The psychologist Thomas Suddendorf at the University of Queensland, whose extensive research on mental time travel has documented that this capacity, while present in rudimentary form in some other species, reaches a level of sophistication in humans that appears to be genuinely unique, particularly with respect to the specific capacity to construct and revisit a coherent, temporally extended narrative of one's own life. Suddendorf's research proposes that nostalgia represents a specific emotional application of this broader mental time travel capacity, one that likely could not exist without the underlying cognitive architecture for constructing an autobiographical narrative that extends significantly into the past and that is experienced as continuous with one's present self. On this account, nostalgia is not a separate cognitive capacity that evolved independently, but a specific emotional consequence of a more general and more fundamental cognitive achievement, the capacity for extended autobiographical self-continuity, that appears to be substantially unique to the human species and that likely evolved to support other crucial human capacities, including long-term planning, the maintenance of stable personal identity across significant life change, and the accumulation and transmission of personal and cultural knowledge across an individual's extended lifespan. There is one more significant dimension of nostalgia research worth examining, because it addresses the question of whether nostalgia operates only at the level of individual psychology or whether it also serves broader social and cultural functions. A question with particular relevance to understanding why nostalgia has become such a conspicuous feature of contemporary culture, from the resurgence of retro aesthetics to the entertainment industry's increasing reliance on reboots, remakes, and revivals of previously popular media. The psychologist Tim Wildschut, extending his research on nostalgia's social connectedness function to the collective level, has documented what he calls collective nostalgia, a form of nostalgic reflection oriented not toward an individual's own personal past, but toward the shared, remembered past of a group with which the individual identifies, whether a nation, a generation, a subculture, or another form of collective identity. Wildschut's research found that collective nostalgia operates through psychological mechanisms substantially similar to individual nostalgia, providing many of the same benefits, including increased social connectedness and increased perceived meaning, but operating at the level of group identity and group belonging rather than purely individual autobiographical memory. This research has significant implications for understanding contemporary social and political phenomena, because Wildschut and other researchers, including the political psychologist J. Van Bavel, have documented that collective nostalgia can be deliberately invoked and amplified for political purposes, functioning as a powerful tool for mobilizing group identity and political sentiment, particularly during periods of significant social change or perceived group status threat, when collective nostalgic appeals to a shared, idealized past can provide the same kind of psychological stability and meaning that individual nostalgia provides for a single person navigating personal transition or uncertainty. The cultural historian and nostalgia researcher Svetlana Boym, whose influential 2001 book The Future of Nostalgia predates much of the contemporary psychological research, but has substantially shaped how scholars across multiple disciplines think about the phenomenon, proposed an influential distinction between what she calls restorative nostalgia, which seeks to literally reconstruct or return to an idealized lost past and often takes on overtly political or nationalist dimensions, and reflective nostalgia, which dwells in the bittersweet longing itself without seeking literal restoration, focusing instead on the individual experience of temporal distance and loss as meaningful in its own right. Boym's distinction has proven influential in helping researchers understand why nostalgia can function, in some contexts, as a benign and even beneficial individual psychological resource of exactly the kind Sedekidis and Wildschut have documented, while simultaneously functioning, in other contexts, as a powerful and sometimes concerning force in collective political and cultural life, driving movements oriented around the restoration of an often selectively remembered or partially invented past. This dual character of nostalgia, beneficial and stabilizing at the individual psychological level, while potentially volatile and manipulable at the collective political level, reflects the same underlying psychological mechanism operating at two different scales: the human capacity to draw meaning, comfort, and a sense of continuous identity from a remembered past, a capacity that functions adaptively when applied to an individual life story navigating ordinary transition and loss, but that can be deliberately amplified and directed toward more consequential and more contested ends when applied to the shared, remembered past of an entire social or political group. This distinction is worth holding on to as we return to the individual experience with which we began, because it clarifies something important about why nostalgia, at the personal level, functions so differently from the more contested collective versions of the same underlying psychological capacity. The nostalgia triggered by a familiar song does not typically demand that the past be literally restored. It does not ask you to return home. It asks only that you visit, briefly, and then return to the present carrying whatever comfort or meaning that visit provided. What emerges from this substantial body of research is a picture of nostalgia, not as a sentimental indulgence or a sign of unhealthy attachment to the past, but as a sophisticated psychological technology, uniquely available to a species with the cognitive capacity for extended autobiographical self-continuity, that serves crucial functions in maintaining psychological stability, social connectedness, and a sense of meaning across the inevitable disruptions, transitions, and losses that a human life necessarily involves. The song that stops you for a moment, pulling you simultaneously into the present and into some specific fragment of your own past, is not a malfunction of memory or an unhealthy retreat from the life you are currently living. It is one of the specific psychological tools that your mind, uniquely among the minds that have existed on this planet, has developed to help you remain a continuous, coherent self across a lifetime that will inevitably require you to lose access to almost every specific moment you have ever lived, while still, somehow, remaining yourself. The bittersweetness is not a flaw in the experience. It is the exact and necessary signature of a mind sophisticated enough to know that it is standing, always, at the point where a specific and unrecoverable past becomes an uncertain and still unwritten future, and that has found a way to visit the one without losing its grip on the other. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.